everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. This week is Constitution Week. Technically, it's September 17th is Constitution Day, but it's the week, right? And this is the hottest legal topic. Now, some of you may be saying, Virginia, there are other hot legal topics this week, and you're right. There are, including the assassination of Charlie King, including some other federal cases regarding the major questions doctrine, things that are going back in front of the Supreme Court. So there is a lot going on. But what we want to do is we want to focus during this time of divisiveness. We want to focus on what joins us. And what joins us is our Constitution. So we're going to talk about the Constitution and Constitution Week, our foundations, what it means, and how it's different than how we celebrated the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. That's our episode. I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm with Tehrani Law, LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. We're practicing in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, and I am joined by my preeminent expert in the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, the amending process, and constitutional law. We have basically the person that has written the books plural, on the Constitution, the amending process. He's even holding one up of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There's a subtitle there that he'll have to read.
Yeah.
But Dr. John Vile, tell us what that subtitle is.
A Comprehensive Encyclopedia of America's Founding, revised second edition, and there are 2 volumes.
There it is.
Literally
the person who's written the book.
Right. And there's also, I have a much smaller book, which if somebody just wanted to buy to read, from a less noted Talbot. No, it's from Rowman and Littlefield. My apologies. Writing and Ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And it's probably a mere, 200 and some pages. And I also have a book.
Compared, just to stop you there, compared to the encyclopedia of 2 volumes,
yes,
that's a fairly light read.
It is. And if you're interested just in the personalities, there's a 400-plus page book on the men who made the Constitution.
So
it's something that is dear to my heart.
Yes, it's amazing. Dr. Vile is currently the Dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, but he was previously the chairman of the Political Science Department and one of my teachers. He actually taught constitutional law to different seminars, I guess, to different semesters while I was attending. And now his talents are being used in other places, but that's why we have him here. Is we're going to bring his knowledge, his expertise, and I'm going to drink while he does that. We are the weekly wine, right? So we got to be drinking something. We have gotten off this summer. I ended up drinking a lot of energy drinks, a lot of caffeinated beverages. Today, I'm not quite on the wine, but I'm close. I got a sour ale. We're trying to finish up this summer, right? We're at the beginning of September, middle of September, and I'm going to finish it up with a basically a sour ale. I love them. I think they taste kind of bittersweet, almost like a wine. And this one has a wonderful flamingo on it. It's from Lone Oak Farm Brewing Company, which is right here in Maryland. I love this company. I visit them a lot. You can actually go in person, do some tastings. They have a great section where you can actually do and hold events, which I've been to multiple times. And this one is actually called Groove It Imperial Sour Ale, and it is pink guava, tartness, and fruitiness. And that's what I'm drinking. Dr. Vile, I think you're a little on the plain side today.
Plain side? I'm on the hard stuff, Pepsi.
Ooh, oh, that is hard for you.
Graduated
more than the water.
From water, yeah. And since you're not going to bring it up, I understand that if I had attended a meeting on Thursday when I think I was helping coach your mock trial team, that I might have seen an award or 2. Is that correct?
You would have. Yes. Thank you. I am part of, I've really gotten involved in our community. I'm in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and I've really joined and worked with the community for the Gaithersburg Germantown Chamber of Commerce, the GGCC. I'm part of the membership committee, and I'm also on the companion company is the Gaithersburg Germantown Community Foundation, which is the nonprofit arm of the GGCC. We help distribute charitable items. We do charitable events. We donate, including to the Police Foundation. So we've done a lot of events, and I'm involved in that heavily. And on Thursday, I received 2 awards. One was for exceptional volunteer service to the GGCC. And the other was a challenge coin for exceptional service, not just volunteer service, but exceptional service to the chamber in working with the community. So I got those on Thursday. Thank you.
You're welcome.
They were,
Congratulations.
thank you. They're pretty awards. You know, I always like the pretty ones.
Yeah.
Even got a little plaque and a little coin because it's the challenge coins. I love those. I got a couple of those from different police departments when I was a prosecutor. So now I get to add that to my collection.
So I'm known at graduations for having the most medallions that I wear. And I have learned the only way to roll with it is to say, yes, this was kindergarten graduation. This was 8th grade graduation. This was a perfect attendance award, etc.
It's so funny. Yeah, you have medallions, ropes, cords.
Yep.
The others,
the whole bit.
Yeah, you're
When
quite
you're
flashy.
honors dean, you can play it up a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, that's why they put you in front.
Yeah, well, sometimes. I mean, I'm not always the eye candy. The university is sometimes in better shape than to have to put me out front.
That's really funny. No, well, you deserve it and you've earned it. And what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of that. Everything you've earned and learned. I know some. I'm not completely ignorant on it, especially with my legal career and with being taught by you for my entire life about the Constitution and politics. But we're going to start, we're not going to go all the way through, but we're going to get some good summaries. So cheers, Dr. Vile, and to all of you for this happy hour or your morning commute, and we'll get started. All right.
Don't mix the two, please.
Which ones?
Happy hour and morning commute.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, please don't do that. We are advocating responsible drinking and responsible driving and not the two together. Yes, agreed. All right. So, Dr. Vile, we had the declaration, and I want to make sure we've got some dates. And by the way, go back if you all are interested in that. We do have a wonderful episode regarding the Declaration of Independence that was put out in 2025 during July 4th week. That's actually gotten quite a lot of hits and views. So do go back and listen to that. But that date was, when was that? Was that the 1776?
That's the one. Yes.
And
then let's add a date. So
yes, please.
It was adopted by the Continental Congress. It was primarily written by Mr. Jefferson. There was a committee of 5. He did most of the original writing. Franklin and Adams made a few emendations. The convention or the Congress made quite a few changes, some for the better, some not. Second Continental Congress went on to recommend what's known as the Articles of Confederation.
And this is not, and a lot of people mishear this, including me when I first did, is the Articles of Confederation is not the Articles of the Confederacy.
No.
Which was during the Civil War.
But there's a similarity in that they were both based on what we call a confederal form of government. In a confederal government, the states have primary sovereignty or power, whereas in a federal government like we have, federal laws are superior to state laws. And under the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America move closer to a government where the states would be sovereign, meaning in this case that they would be able to have perpetuated slavery forever. So but yeah, the Articles of Confederation, they were the first attempt at a nationwide colony-wide government to replace the British government against which we had declared independence. It was proposed in 1777. Many of the states ratified pretty quickly. It had to be ratified by all of the states.
And how many states did we have at that time?
Well, you had 13 colonies.
Okay.
Which became states. But it was not ratified till 1781, and that was primarily because of Maryland. So, because they refused to agree to join the Confederacy until the large the states that had large Western land holdings, Virginia most notably, probably Pennsylvania, Georgia, probably some of the others, until they relinquished those rights to the federal government because their concern was that
Oh,
they would just be overwhelmed. And so that government remained in effect from 1781. Well, it was in effect in 1787 when it became fairly apparent that it wasn't working particularly well. We were
may I
not able
pause
to,
you there?
yeah,
So that government is that was truly just the states being led, and there was no president of a United States.
that's right. There was a president of Congress, but he was not, we didn't have separation of powers. He would have been with Congress. And there was no independent federal judiciary. Um, so you basically had, and you had a Congress of one house, what we call a unicameral house, and each state had a single vote. And it was a fairly rigid document. Most key matters, sounds a little bit like the filibuster today in the Senate. Most key matters require the consent of 9 of the 13 states. Congress had limited power, so it didn't have the power of interstate commerce. It didn't have the power to control interstate commerce. It didn't have the power of direct taxation.
Hmm.
The national government wanted money, they could request the states, but if the states didn't pay, there was really no way to enforce it. And then, probably most critically, the articles required unanimous state consent to amendments. And you
Oh,
had a
wow.
couple times where as many as 11 or 12 states would agree to something fairly basic, and then one state would hold out. Rhode Island was notorious for this. They often called it Rogue's Island.
Oh, that's so funny. I've never heard that.
Yeah, yeah. But in any
Oh,
case, and then in the, well, what happened is you had a preliminary meeting of Virginia and Maryland over the issue of navigation on the Potomac River because
mm.
you didn't have national control over interstate commerce. You actually had, well, not only did you have concerns over the rules of navigation, but you had some states that were putting tariffs on other states.
Oh, wow.
New Jersey was likened to a barrel with a tap on both ends because it was being taxed by New York on one side, and I guess Pennsylvania, or I don't know probably
Possibly New
Pennsylvania on
Jersey.
the other side. And so Virginia and Maryland met to discuss primarily navigation on the Potomac River,
Hmm.
and it was fairly successful. And so the delegates said, well, why don't we call a convention of all the states to deal with navigation and commerce? And that was seemingly unsuccessful. It was called for Annapolis, Maryland. Only 5 state delegations showed up, but clenching victory from defeat, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Dickinson, if I remember, several others said, well, the reason this didn't work is because the subject was too limited. Let's
Mm.
call a convention to deal with all the problems and to revise and enlarge the Articles of Confederation to take care of them.
So
And
this
that
became
went
the second Constitutional Congress or convention.
Second Continental Congress, right? It actually went on for some time. The Second Continental Congress. It was the same Congress. Well, that Congress sort of was morphed into the Articles of Confederation. It remained a unicameral Congress with states having, each state having equal representation. And that winter, there was a sort of a taxpayer revolt. Some people say partly justified in Massachusetts. And the state and the national government proved relatively ineffective in taking care of it expeditiously. And this convinced other states that, yeah, we ought to go ahead and have a convention to look at the whole thing. Now, what's
Okay, I'm going to pause here too
okay?
because this seems ironic to me, and maybe I'm using the wrong word.
Okay.
Boston, Massachusetts was responsible for the tea,
Hmm.
and
But
that
this
was
was a
related
state
to.
tax. In other words, basically what happened after the revolution, species, your money in circulation was very limited.
Mm.
And so particularly probably in farm areas. So if your state issued a tax and you had to pay it in gold or silver and you didn't have it, you get your lands foreclosed.
Oh,
And people don't like that. Farmers tend to
yeah.
revolt when that
Well,
happens.
and that's the thing is the Boston Tea Party was about taxes. This
From
other
Britain. Right.
Massachusetts issue, even though it wasn't,
Right.
a federal issue and state,
Right.
it's still about taxes. And how much so do we continue to deal with this? Is, even DC right now is,
Sure.
taxation without representation, that a lot of the issues, even among the states or between a state and a national government, has continued to be taxes. And now we're dealing with tariffs.
Yes.
We're almost like, married couples. One of the biggest controversies is finances
I
and
can't
money.
imagine.
No, yeah, you and your wife,
No, I'm from we spent some time in Louisiana, and the most famous quotation down there was from not Huey, Earl Long, I think it was, who said, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree."
Oh, that's
We're
funny.
always trying to pass on taxes to somebody else, and that's part of what the current tariff controversy is.
Right.
Let's make other countries, let's make China pay.
Mhm.
Uh, let's make Switzerland pay. They're ripping us off with those expensive watches.
Right. And, if we can make them pay, that would be some of that man behind the tree. It would be lovely.
Exactly. Well, and you'll see this, probably an unexplored area of the law is how many states and localities put fairly major taxes on people that are visiting.
Oh, yeah.
So you go to a motel bill, and of course that can backfire, because if they become too high, then people may say, well, I'm not going to
We
go.
don't go
I'm not
there.
going to go to this city. I'm going to go to another one. But it's very easy to raise a tax on hotels where mostly you're going to have out-of-state visitors than it is on your own people.
Absolutely. And even in Tennessee, you all don't have the income tax, but you
That's
have
right.
an extremely high sales tax.
Yes.
Which I think some of the idea there is the same, is if visitors, guests, anybody who's coming in, especially to Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, that they get charged higher rates than most other states. So we'll
And
get
again,
more
I
from
don't know that
them.
it's that much higher, but
It's high.
one of my favorite mugs was the one that my parents gave to me, and had a picture of a bear chasing tourists, and it said, "Please send more tourists. The last ones were very tasty."
So visit Tennessee.
Visit Tennessee, yes. And to my knowledge, we've had no recent bear attacks. Okay.
That's so funny. But this all led, and I know I'm jumping a little bit, but all of these taxation issues that you're discussing between, one state taxing the other, give essentially
Right.
tariffs to each other state in the way that it worked. This has led to the Commerce Clause.
Sure.
And what was put into the Constitution of the Commerce Clause, and states can't tax each other, where
Right.
it's limiting it to, states can tax their own people, and
Right.
states can issue sales tax, et cetera. But the federal government is the one that can tax the states and receive
Right.
that
And,
money.
and again, to be clear here, when we're talking about the hotel taxes, they can't be discriminatory. You
Correct.
can't say we're going to charge out-of-state citizens a higher sales tax or a higher hotel tax than we would in-state citizens. But,
The
if you,
presumption is
yeah,
that
but
it's more out of state.
right. But I mean, if you believe in free enterprise, as I basically do, what what the Constitution did is it created a much greater, it's sort of like the European Common Market. If you're paying every time you buy a good from another state, or bring in trying to tax other states, that's going to depress commerce in general, which is going to depress the economy in general. So there were some significant weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. And again, the national government couldn't tax the states directly. They also couldn't raise military directly.
Mm.
If there was a Native American attack, or you feared Spanish or English forces, you could petition the states to send troops, but you couldn't actually draft them as we would today if we were in a national crisis.
And this is
So
why each state had their own militia.
that's
And
right.
we get the militia piece into the Constitution as well.
Right. Absolutely. And there was a fear, which continues to some extent, but the so-called anti-federalists, particularly those who initially opposed the new Constitution, there was a great fear of a standing army because, and this, by the way, this also comes into contemporary issues.
Yeah.
The fear is that if you have a standing army that can be used against your own citizens, then you can have a much more likely to have an oppressive government. And so, it's not exactly the same, but we're getting some of this issue with, you know, now DC is its own entity. It is more subject to federal control than others, but
It's
when
technically a territory, a district.
well, I think I don't even know if territory is quite the word, but whatever word it is, special district,
Mhm.
you do need to remember, or we need to remember that if federal troops come in, whether they're National Guardsmen from another state or whether they're military, as in Los Angeles, you are somewhat usurping and always raising the possibility that you're interfering with the local authorities who are responsible for crime. And, particularly when it comes to military forces, they have a unique set of important skills, but they're not skills typically that are employed against American citizens. They're employed against enemies abroad.
They're
And
more a defense of the entire United States.
that's right. And one of the issues that's come forth in California is, the Posse Comitatus Act was adopted after the Civil War. And actually it was adopted, if I remember correctly, either 1876 or 1877. Federal troops had been occupying southern states for good reasons. They had rebelled against the United States. They were refusing to honor the 13th through 15th, well, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendment.
Right.
But when they were withdrawn in 1877, Congress basically adopted a law that says, you know, federal troops should not be enforcing local laws. And, often you can somewhat get around that and say, well, we're not enforcing local laws. We're using it to protect federal buildings, or we're using it for
Right.
this or that. But often the two bleed over into one another. And so it is interesting that, we think we've made great progress, and we have in some ways, but the issues are often recurring. But the short of it is the Shays Rebellion that happened in Massachusetts convinced enough states so that ultimately all the states except Rogues Island
Rogues Island.
sent delegates to Philadelphia to revise and correct the Articles of Confederation. And instead, there's a famous book on the convention called the Framers' Coup. And I don't particularly like the word because coup often implies violence, and that did not happen
Right.
here. But most delegates arrived, I think, believing they were simply going to add a few powers to Congress, make some cosmetic changes. And instead, the Virginia delegation, which got there first, and was intellectually, well, Washington was, I guess, sort of the titular leader, but the
Was
intellectual
Madison?
leader of the Virginia delegation was James Madison.
Yeah.
And in the Virginia plan, which was initially proposed in the convention, they didn't start with a revision. They said, we have a whole new plan. So instead of one branch of government, we're going to add two more. We're going to have an independent presidency. We're going to have an independent judiciary. Instead of one house of Congress, we're going to have two. Instead of a weak Congress, we're going to enumerate a series of 18, 19 different powers that they're going to exercise. And most importantly, and of course, Virginia was the most populous state at the time.
Because it also included the land of West Virginia that we know now.
It did, and again, prior to the Articles, they also had large Western land claims, but they proposed that both houses of the new Congress be apportioned according to population. So they would have had probably 13-1 population over the smaller states,
Especially Rhode Island.
Yeah.
If their rogue
which
likes
wasn't
to overcome
represented
them.
conveniently. But this was sort of this is what they started with. And after about 2 weeks, Virginians were riding high. They were doing well. And then William Patterson of New Jersey, one T rather than two, stands up and says, we have another proposal, and the so-called New Jersey plan is introduced.
Mm.
Now, one of the fascinating things about the New Jersey plan is it doesn't look as different as you might expect from the Virginia plan because it comes after. You've had 2 weeks of deliberation and debate. They've already agreed to some things. So it's like going back now and deciding, no, we're going to go back to one branch of government. That's not going to work. So the
Yeah.
central innovation of the New Jersey plan is we want to stick with what we have now, equal representation in Congress. And that becomes one of the leading issues at the
Mm.
Constitutional Convention. And the result, by the way, ends up with arguably the most undemocratic part of our current Constitution, which is that, in the House, each state is represented roughly according to population. Each state has at least one vote, so there's some discrepancies there. But each state, basically, you can have from 1 to 50 some delegates, depending on their population. But then in the other branch, the Senate, which is a very important branch, the confirmation powers, approving treaties, and as well as other legislation. It under what became known as the Connecticut Compromise, each state is represented equally, and so you'll see a lot of I'd say the main criticisms right now of the U.S. Constitution, if your criticism rests on democracy, it's the Senate, which is clearly malapportioned. But for a reason, right? I mean, these states did give up something originally, the original 13. If you were a small state, you were saying,
Right.
okay, we're giving up equal representation in one house for equal representation only in one instead of both. So that the Electoral College
Mm.
was another area of compromise. How do we choose a new president? It's the method we have is not completely democratic. You can win the
Right.
popular vote and lose the electoral vote. That's often criticized as well. So both of those, well, and I guess the most criticized part of the Constitution, fortunately, we've now don't have to worry with, at least not directly, was what are we going to do about slavery? And
Mm.
essentially, the
Right.
Constitution left slavery. It didn't endorse it. It didn't condemn it, but it basically left it in place. And it gave some incentive in that if you were a state that had slaves, your slaves would count, even though they weren't voting, they
Right.
would count as 3/5 of a person each slave would, when it came to apportioning representation.
Right. They were
And so in the
counted
early,
essentially as population.
right. So, I mean, if you're looking, if you look at the first five presidents, four of them are from Virginia. And that's not coincidental. Virginia got, not only did they have, in your electoral college, to go back a minute, your electoral college is your votes of a state. You add the two senators that each state has to the representatives. So you have a big advantage there already for a state like Virginia, which is the most
Right.
populous. And then you add to it the 3/5 clause. Some people call Thomas Jefferson the Negro president because
Because
had
right.
Virginia not had slaves, there's a fairly close contest in the 1800 election between Mr. Adams of Massachusetts and Mr. Jefferson of Virginia. And Mr.
Mm.
Jefferson, and that got even more convoluted when everybody who voted for Jefferson also voted for his vice president, and you had to go into the House of Representatives.
Wow.
But the main thing you get out of the Constitutional Convention, and this is and this is important in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, and realizing that, we had, just a month or so ago, we had a family and their dog, killed by an assassin in Minnesota, apparently, someone on the other side of the political spectrum. The
Right.
commitment of the delegates was reason.
Mm.
And, what happened after the convention and again, this goes to this theme of the framers' coup. under the Articles, each state had to ratify an amendment. But when the Constitution was sent out, the delegates decided that it'll go into effect when two-thirds, or nine, I guess it was, yeah, two-thirds of the states approve. And so, where am I heading with that? Well,
How it
you've
relates currently.
disregarded part of the Articles of Confederation because, I mean, realistically, you got two problems. One is one state didn't even show up at the convention, so you're not going to
Right.
get their agreement with it. And then, secondly, anybody who looked closely at the Constitutional Convention would realize that most state legislators were going to lose power in relation to Congress.
Mm.
So what happened is the delegates said, now they did something else clever. We're going to send it to the states for ratification, but we're going to bypass existing state legislators. We're going to send it to conventions in each state. And
Oh,
at the
interesting.
time, a convention was the closest we would have today would be our modern referendum, which
Okay.
is they thought the most democratic form of representation would be we're going to elect delegates specifically for the purpose of deciding up or down on the convention. And then we had this period of debate between the
Mm.
Federalists, supporters of the new Constitution, the Anti-Federalists who were afraid that it was creating too much power to the national government, and the like. And it was in this context that the so-called Federalist Papers were written. And you
Sure.
probably have a lot more people on television and elsewhere who refer to the Federalist Papers than who actually read it. But I can assure people that my copy's not quite as well worn as my copy of the Bible, but it comes pretty close.
It's very
Um,
well read.
I like to be like John Marshall Harlan the First, who was said to sleep soundly every night, and I forget which was which, but he had either the Constitution under his pillow and the Bible on his bedside, or vice versa. But
Two great documents to have.
yeah, the great documents to have. Federalist Papers are, and there were pamphlets, hundreds of pamphlets on both sides. Federalist Papers, primarily written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and then John Jay. They were written in support of the Constitution. And in the very first Federalist, basically the question that Hamilton poses is, are we as a society able to decide by reason, or are we going to have to let our future be determined by force? And I
Hmm.
think that's the question that this recent assassination and others pose. And it raises a broader question, which is to what degree are we going to be, what would we say, energized, catalyzed
Hmm.
by, well, somebody shot one of the people we support, we ought to go out and shoot one of theirs.
Right.
Was it
Which is
Gandhi who
more of
said,
a
yeah,
gang related idea of starting a
well, it
gang war
is.
is you shot one of our gang members, we're
Right.
going to take out yours, or the
And if we
mafia.
have viewers here, if if you if you find that somebody dies of political violence and you can't be concerned for a widow and
Mm.
orphans, then you need to re-examine yourself,
Right.
because that's not human. I mean,
Right.
humanity requires a certain empathy, a certain sympathy with others, and you can violently disagree with somebody violently. Well, you can vehemently
Strenuously,
disagree
vehemently.
with somebody without doing it violently. So,
Right.
if we go to I think largely we were success. We move from the Declaration to the Articles to the Constitution successfully, and over 200 now, what, 38 years, I guess it'll be, right? 11 years, Constitution's 11 years
Right.
beyond the Declaration of Independence, at least the writing of it was. For 200 years, we've largely avoided. Now, we got one big exception there, the Civil War.
Right.
Um, but, anybody who's read that time in our history knows that that is not something we ever want to happen again. And, I don't think it's likely to happen, but we got a lot of loose talk right now about, well, there's war. Well, if you don't have any friends, if you're a liberal and you don't have any friends who are conservative, and you're a conservative and you don't have any friends that are liberal, you need to get off your duff and start making some, because
Right. There's a
there
lot
are
more hate than joining, because even with the Constitutional Congress, there were strong opinions on both
absolutely,
sides, but they respected each other ultimately and decided to make a decision where they would come together as a
yeah.
country rather than use their opinions to divide it.
There's actually, it's not quite the same, but there was a debate in the first Continental Congress. I forget. I gave a speech on it this week and have now forgotten, but someone made a motion that they should begin each day with prayer.
Mm,
And two of the most religious people got up and said, I don't think we can do it. We got Anglicans, we got Baptists, we got Methodists, Presbyterians. I don't think we can agree on it. And then Samuel Adams, who was a militant sort of evangelical Christian, I guess is what you would call him, said, well, he was not so prejudiced as to believe that someone from another faith or another denomination couldn't lead in prayer.
mm.
And they did, as it turns out. Now, Constitutional Convention, they did not begin in prayer. uh, Benjamin Franklin suggested that they ought to, but part of it was there seemed to be a fear that if in the middle of the convention, when they're facing all these problems over, how states are going to be represented, if we start bringing in a chaplain, all these proceedings were secret, people are going to know that something's going wrong. We never
Oh,
pray unless we absolutely need to,
that's
which
funny.
is, not a good route to follow, but
Right.
nonetheless, that's what happened.
And with that, so the Constitution that we have, at least
Mhm.
the
7 articles.
right, exactly, the articles that we have within the Constitution, they were ratified and
That's
adopted
right.
in what year?
Well, it's a little tricky. They went into effect largely in 1789, but there's been a whole book that describes the transition. As you can imagine, some
Mm,
of it was sort of seamless. I would imagine, I don't know this, but I would imagine the post office would not change a lot from whether you're under the articles or whether you're under the national government. Whereas your whole composition of Congress would change. You'd have an elected president for the first time. And, one of the beauties of George Washington is he was very, and other members of Congress too, but particularly Washington, was very conscious that whatever he did would become a precedent. And
mm,
this is what we need to do again for the future. I think a lot of politicians right now, they're gaining immediate political gain by demonizing their opponents. Left
right.
wing lunatics or right wing nuts or, whatever they would call them. But the Washington was among those who looked ahead, and it's like, not just what are people going to think of me, but what's the proper way to do an inaugural address? What's the proper way to accept an ambassador? What's the proper way to suggest to Congress that they ought to adopt legislation?
Mm.
By the way, may I mention a couple books that are coming out and that have come out on the
Please.
Constitution? Now, these are more on the Constitution than they are on the Constitutional Convention, but it is Constitution Week. This
It
is one
is.
that I really love. Stephen Smith, called The Godless Constitution and the Providential Republic. And I need to look him up here. He's at University of San Diego, a law professor, and he's responding in part to an earlier book, which I actually thought had a lot of good sense. But it was called The Godless Constitution. And it basically said, well, the U.S. Constitution is godless because it doesn't mention God.
Mm,
And it doesn't unless you count in the year of our Lord, 1787.
sure.
Um, but he says, hold on a minute. That's not how we usually use the term godless. Uh, if you take a math test and it doesn't mention God, you don't call it a godless math test, right? You
Right.
just say, wasn't about God, it was about mathematics.
Sure.
So he argues that although the document didn't mention God, we have a good 200-year history plus of people invoking the deity, particularly in presidential inaugurations. And especially if you get up to the 1960s. In a single decade, we adopted um, national motto,
Mm,
In God We Trust. We added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. We added a national prayer breakfast. And he says we've never been anti-God in the way that
mm.
some, let's say, communist constitutions have been. Atheism is proclaimed doctrine. And so he paints, I think, a much more balanced picture of U.S. history. And then I've read another wonderful book by a Harvard professor, just got through reading it, The Changing Constitution. It doesn't, we've talked before about my own book that just came out on companion to the U.S. Constitution. My book goes clause by clause, and his does not. His goes sort of topic by topic, but he does a very good job, particularly regarding how to interpret the Constitution.
Mm.
Um, there are a lot of people who on the court who embrace what's known as originalism, and this goes
Sure.
back to what we said about the Constitutional Convention. If they were consistent, and nobody is on either side, or not fully consistent, then every time you looked at a clause in the Constitution, you would say, well, what was the public meaning at the time it was adopted?
Right.
So if you want to find out what interstate commerce is, you go to dictionaries that say, give you
Mm.
several definitions of commerce, and then you try to interpret it that way. Now, one of the problems with that is, of course, because not only interpretations change, which means we have new legal precedents, but also the Constitution itself changes. As you
Right.
know, one of my favorite parts of the Constitution is Article 5 that talks about adding amendments. And to take an example now, there's a book coming out, a third edition of a book that was originally edited by Edmund Meese, and I'm not sure if he's still the editor or not, but The Heritage Guide to the Constitution. I've used it, but it's very limited in the sense that everything is interpreted through originalism. So you look at the provisions in the Constitution for right to counsel, and they rightly say, well, at the time the Constitution was written, this meant if you could afford counsel, you could have one.
Sure.
Whereas I think most of us today would say, well, that's inconsistent with equal protection of the laws. If you
Absolutely.
have somebody who just doesn't have any money, they shouldn't be more liable to be convicted of murder that they didn't commit just because they can't afford an attorney.
Right.
So, but he deals head on with this, and I think in a very able way. And then there's another book that I love the first half of it, and then I thought he got off on a tangent, and I have no idea how to pronounce his name. Dab Howala, perhaps. What is free speech? As you know, I contribute regularly to the First Amendment Encyclopedia, so I'm particularly interested in this. He has a much more negative view than I do of. I, I don't know that I'm a First Amendment absolutist, but I would rather approach the First Amendment that says when Congress shall make no law, that it means Congress shall make no law. And
Right.
then if we want to say, well, free speech doesn't include libel, free speech doesn't include true threats, it doesn't include fighting words, I'm for that. But if your attitude is, well, speech is always contextual, you always have to balance, my fear is that and what he does do, and I mean, he points to, he says we have to be careful that understanding, particularly when it comes to freedom of the press, that not everyone has equal access to the press.
Sure.
And particularly at a time where you have Fox and you have Gannett and you have some of these broadcasters with tremendous financial resources behind them,
Right.
the marketplace of ideas might not work out the same way it would if we were all in a classroom and were equally entitled, maybe other than the professor, with the right to speak. And
Sure.
so, it's a good caveat. I think he takes it a little bit too far. But then for those who are, if you're like me and you wait every week for what books are coming out, two
Mm.
books coming out
Aren't
this
we all?
week. Yeah, aren't we all? Akil Amar has a book called Born Equal, which deals with U.S. Constitution from 1840 to 1920. And I'm assuming the 1920, that would take us right past the adoption of the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. And then Jill Lepore, a noted historian, has a book called We the People, which apparently is going to tread on my territory because
Oh.
my understanding is that much of it deals not so much with the original Constitution as it does with the constitutional amendments. Both of these are very able scholars, very good writers. I believe both are fairly formidable volumes. But that will give me something to do in my spare time. And I know that probably everyone in your audience, fortunately, I've already gotten my
Oh,
order in.
yes.
So now I will not be backed up by all the other people trying to get a hit on me in the Amazon line here.
Yes, absolutely. Everybody go get yours quickly because they may be sold out.
That's right.
So these books and the interesting part to me, and a lot of people didn't know, is and may not still know that the Constitution, when it was adopted, did not include amendments. Those
That's
came
right.
afterwards.
Thank you. And that's where I was headed, and then I got sidetracked by thinking of all the books I get to read next week.
Which are exciting, right?
But the most notable outcome of the debates between Federalist supporters and Anti-Federalist supporters was that the Anti-Federalists sort of their primary critique, although sometimes it may have been hiding other motives, but their primary critique that stuck was, why don't we have a bill or a Declaration of Rights? And this was adopted at the end of the convention. George Mason, about whom I've also written a book, he and another delegate, at least one other, Pinckney, proposed that the Constitution ought to adopt a Bill of Rights. And the predominant sentiment of the convention was, we don't really need one because we have a constitution of enumerated powers, meaning we have specified what the powers of Congress are, and they don't include the power to interfere with religion or freedom of speech or to deprive a person of fair trial and the like. And the response sort of was, well, if you don't have anything to be afraid of, if it doesn't matter, why not put them in there for double security?
Exactly. And I think that was interesting because at the time it was like, well, we don't need them because everyone knows them. Everyone
Right.
will follow them. Why would we need
Well,
to
and
put
states, of
them in
course,
writing?
most of them had their own bills or declarations of rights. But here's a case where, again, compromise was very important. Madison did not, if you read the Federalist, and Hamilton makes the argument more clearly, but neither of them thought they needed a Bill of Rights. But when he saw that public opinion was turning against the document because of it, it's like, can't do any harm and it might do some good. And
Right.
his friend, Mr. Jefferson, writes to him from Paris, basically saying, I really think we need one of these. We can't, the American government to a large degree, now see if I'm going to contradict myself, I might,
Oh, no.
but it's based on mistrust to the extent that we don't want any single person or even branch of government having complete power. We don't
Right.
even want the national government having all power. And that's why, this comes out in many of these issues that we're having right now. So tariffs, well, somebody has to have the tariff power, but is it the president or is it the Congress? Or do they
Right.
share that power? Law enforcement. Clearly, there are provisions in the Constitution that if your state is invaded or your government's about to be overthrown, that the governor can call and ask for federal troops. But can a president send in troops when they're not asked?
Right.
And there was a deep suspicion of human nature. Not in a bad. I mean, the fact that they appealed to reason meant that they believed that there were higher qualities in human beings that could decide on rational solutions. But the fact that they also believed that human beings were inherently selfish,
Right.
inherently self-interested, meant that you don't trust any single person. Of course, they had suffered under what they considered to be a British tyrant, and they weren't
Right.
about to set one up in the United States and replace him.
Hmm. Well, good to know, good to remember, good to think of what brought us together. The compromises that brought us together that still created an amazing form of government, an amazing country that has lasted under federalism and republicanism
Right.
democracy, a little bit of everything thrown in. And a lot of people have commented throughout our podcast of no, it's not just a democracy. It's not just a
No,
republic.
that's right.
And that's true. It's a combination. It's a democratic republic is technically what we've set up, where it's not all one and it's not all the other. It is a combination.
And
Um,
basically it's rule of law
right.
with, and again, there's great wisdom, and I do think one can argue, and apparently Lepore doesn't in her new book, and a couple of the others that I've read recently. You can argue that our constitutional amending process is too difficult.
Sure.
Two-thirds of both houses of Congress, three-quarters of the states.
It's a
We
lot.
we all know amendments. Maybe Equal Rights Amendment would be an example that was favored at least initially by the population and not adopted. Maybe the same thing true for representation in DC. Um, but we do have a process whereby a constitution can be amended, and some of, I mean, it took a war to get it adopted, but slavery
Right.
was eliminated. It took 70 years or better for women's rights advocates to get the right to vote to women, but we were able to get it. Uh, it took over 100 years to get direct election of senators, and that was another,
Mm,
one of the provisions in the original Constitution was that the state legislature selected them. So the amending process has democratized the U.S. Constitution, but not fully. And
right.
and you always find a critic, sometimes very vehemently, well, the U.S. Constitution isn't perfect. Well,
Of course
the
not.
founders would never have expected any human document to be a perfect document. And James Madison, in maybe an irreverent moment, or maybe it's just a realistic moment, says even when God condescends to speak to mankind, people disagree over. We can look at this as Abraham Lincoln would later say. We all pray to the same God, we read the same scripture, and yet we come to different conclusions. And
Right.
hopefully, we don't have to do like we did in the Civil War and fight them out on the battlefield. There's plenty of room in the academy and in the elsewhere, but there's so much. One of the things you see right now is so much discussion of people apparently being radicalized
Right.
by getting on the net, getting
Yes.
one set of friends, one set of news sources, and I would just caution it, just in the day or two after this assassination, how many initial false reports there were
Of
that you'd
course
look at them and say, this can't be true. And sure enough, 2 hours later, you'd find
they
out
are.
that it wasn't.
Yeah.
Or you didn't find out and you built a whole theory around it, which is
Exactly.
maybe as
Is
common.
right. And as an attorney, that's something that we're held ethically to. Is don't assume things. Don't put out a
Right.
theory that isn't based on facts. Many of our complaints, our lawsuits have to say upon information and belief. So it's
Right.
not just your opinion. You're not just stating an opinion. A court can't decide on your opinion. They have to decide based on the facts, the
Well, and
evidence.
as I discussed with your mock trial students last week, what's the chief objection often to evidence is hearsay.
Exactly.
Reporting what you've heard second, third, or maybe even,
Fourth hand.
yeah, even farther from somebody else who may or may not be qualified to speak on the topic, or may not,
Exactly.
probably wasn't an eyewitness.
There's
Doesn't
always
have.
that good of pause, right? There's a lot of the psychological theories of give it 10 seconds before you speak, pause,
Yeah,
breathe, count
that's a
to
good one.
10. It is the same kind of theory is if everyone just takes a pause, lets
Well,
it
and
play out a
again,
minute.
uh, often if somebody brings a bizarre report to me, the first thing I'll do is say, okay, let's look. I sort of CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, BBC, several other sources, sort of on speed dial, and if none of them are if something seems really bizarre and nobody else is reporting it, better give it a second look, find out where it
Yeah.
came from. And particularly, we like to downplay this, and I don't like the notion that maybe Soviet agents and Chinese agents are influencing what we're getting, but they clearly
Right.
are, or it seems to me they clearly
Uh,
are. I mean, we know
Right.
there's good evidence that they have tried to swing American elections, and they have every interest in sowing division among us.
Absolutely.
We need to be wary.
All right. So everybody take a pause, come together, review the things, review the people, think of the people ultimately behind it, not just the ideas. But review the ideas, consider them, have a debate, have a good debate, have one that's not just screaming and not accepting other opinions, but being open to what's being said.
Yeah. And
In that way, let's come together. And Dr. Vile, any final thoughts on
there
Constitution Week?
is, if you're in a debate, don't use words like fascist or
Yeah.
communist or lunatic or whatever, unless you're using them in a very precise scientific fashion. You will never persuade an opponent by calling them one of these names.
Right.
You might persuade public opinion temporarily, but over time, people are going to look and say, that every time there's an enemy, you call them a fascist or you call them left-wing lunatic or whatever it is. That is not, that's probably the lowest form of argument that you can have is name calling. And it usually is
Absolutely.
resorted to by people who really don't have solid evidence for what they're saying.
Yeah, and it's more insightful. It's like calling people you're crazy.
Yeah,
Well, I'm not going to listen to. I don't want to listen to
right,
somebody who's just saying that I'm crazy or my ideas are crazy.
right.
It's the same. My husband and I have a rule in our disagreements of we don't curse. We don't curse at all because those words are inciting. Those words amp it up. They raise the level of the argument and people stop
Yeah.
listening once those types of words are used. And it's the same idea of when those different words, when the name calling is there, when they're derogatory terms, when they're inciting terms, it raises the volume.
And
It
so,
raises the level of anger.
yeah, we've talked about this before, but one of the exceptions to speech, which is rarely enforced, by the way, is the doctrine of fighting words.
Right.
But it's a notion that, calling a police officer or anybody else an SOB to their face is not going to, people are not going to say, oh, well, I wonder about my parentage. No, you're going to immediately react, well, so you call me an SOB, I'm going to call you a bastard or, whatever, whatever else.
Exactly.
And so,
There's the immediate initial
right,
emotional
it
response.
doesn't appeal to reason. It's simply designed to raise your emotion. And usually, an emotion, we can sometimes act quickly, but usually we don't think at our best.
Right. It's a provocation.
Yes.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us. Hope you learned a thing or two. Hopefully you see where we're coming from and the ultimate human reasoning behind it. Read the Constitution. Go back, put it by your bedside, take a read, take a look, grab a copy of the Federalist Papers. Those are quite exciting too. And then check out the books that Dr. Vile has mentioned. Certainly those are not on my bedside table, but they certainly are good reads. And check us out on thelawunscripted.com. Check us out. Check out our bar prep materials where we've discussed different subjects through lectures, through discussions, through hypotheticals while you're going through your law school classes as a law student or undergrad, or even just want to know a little bit more about criminal law, constitutional law, civil law. Take a look at those and check out our fun merch. We've got some fun merch, some funny things that everybody can take a good look and have a laugh at versus the division. Laughter is always sometimes the best medicine and the best use in this specific time. So check us out and we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.